So now you've learned about the major compromise over representation made between the large and small states at the Constitutional Convention, and that was probably the biggest blowout, we'll call it, at the convention. But there was another major compromises made on the issues of slavery and the tariff. Now, one of those words, tariff, you may not know yet, but I'm going to give you a definition and show you an example of what it was and why it was such an issue, and why these were compromises made between two distinct regions, the North and the South. So, the same objective from the previous presentation. Again, we're looking at the compromise. What were the compromises made to establish the Constitution, to allow it to actually go into effect? And so the essential question today, though, and this is the one on your Cornell notes, is how did the framers of the Constitution resolve the conflict between the northern and southern states, specifically on the issue of slavery and tariffs? A vocabulary word here for you. A tariff is a tax on goods and products shipped in from other countries. This is actually going to be an issue not just now, but for years and years and years down the road. It will lead to some states even threatening to leave the nation altogether. That'll be with South Carolina and Andrew Jackson. We will get to that at a later date. But keep in mind, this idea of tariff is really important, and it starts here. So again, I want a little refresher of North and South economies. In the South, it was largely based in agriculture, almost entirely. Whether they were small farmers or plantations, it was all rooted in agriculture, and specifically cotton and tobacco on those large plantations. And slave labor, as we discussed earlier in the year, was necessary for these large plantations to exist in order for them to produce these large quantities of crops. There were no machines, harvesters for that to occur. They had to rely on actual human labor, and the cheapest form of that was actually slave labor. In the North, there were a wide variety of different jobs, markets. There were farmers, fishers, merchants, bankers, laborers, just run-of-the-mill type of people doing your everyday jobs that you would expect. There was agriculture, but it was not the sole part of the economy as it was in the South. And another major important part of the northern economy is trade. Trade was very important. We have New York, major trade hub that was being established, and many others in the north as well. But trade was very important, especially internationally with other nations. So look at how slavery was developing. This map goes up to 1740. We're actually looking at the date roughly 1790, but this is good nonetheless. You will see in general on this map that the population of slavery has just grown exponentially from 1640 to 1780. And the states here, in the red number is kind of what we just want to focus on in these little blips here showing the states. You'll notice that all of the northern states have a very small population of slaves. In fact, New York, I believe, is the largest one there in the north with almost 9,000. The rest are just in the very small thousands. But then you look at Maryland, you've got 24,000. Virginia, 60,000. You've got North Carolina, 11. South Carolina, 30. And this just grows and grows and grows and grows. And it shows you where slavery was developing and where it wasn't. In fact, by the time the Constitution will be written and ratified, most northern states are essentially eradicating slavery. They realize there's really not a need for it. So I wanted you to see visually here where slavery was developing and where it really was not. So let's start with the tariff disputes. Northern states, they wanted tariffs. Now this is very general, but in general, northern states wanted tariffs because it made other nations' products more expensive. We'll think about England in this case. And in doing so, by making other nations' products expensive, by taxing other nations' products, it would encourage Americans to buy products made in North America. The idea here is that they wanted to protect the businesses in America and help them grow by limiting the number of imported goods for people to buy at a cheaper price than what the American industries could make it for. So in the example I'm going to show you was cloth. And that's a great example because that's something that was actually a major industry developing at the time, was cloth. If you could buy a cloth t-shirt for $10 from another country compared to $20 in America, more than likely you're going to buy the $10 one, or at least a majority of people will, because it's cheaper. So to give you an example of this, how a tariff works, we have an example of Britain. British-made cloth costs $4 in Britain. That's how much it costs to make it. When it's shipped into the United States, America would tax it with a 25% tariff, which 25% of 4 is $1. So when it gets into the United States, the British cloth would actually cost $5 a roll to make. And the American-made cloth cost $4. So this is a very simple explanation, but what it would do is make the British-made cloth more expensive with this tariff, and so you'd be more encouraged to purchase the American-made cloth for $4. Now again, very simple explanation, but that's basically how it worked. Actually, Britain probably produced it much cheaper in comparison to the United States, but they would tax it enough to make it more expensive, so that then again, the American product would be less expensive. And that benefited northern industries because that's where the industries were in the north. The south, again, mostly agriculture. So you have to remember, it's mostly going to be benefiting the north in this case. So that's exactly how the South saw it. The tariff increased the cost of manufactured goods they bought from Europe. Not everything was available for purchase in America, and so some things were taxed, and it did cost them more money just because there was a tariff. And they did feel that this tariff benefited the northern economy over the South, because again, the South is mostly agriculture-based. But the things they did have to buy from Europe would be more expensive just because of this tariff. So I want you to pause for a minute, review your notes, and answer these two questions. How are the economies of the North and South different? And why did the North and South disagree over the ideas of tariffs? You can go ahead and pause the video while you're doing that. Okay, so here are the compromises that they're going to make over these issues. We'll start with the slavery compromises. These are to please the South. That's where slavery mostly exists. We have the 3/5 compromise. This has to do with representation, actually, so we're back at that debate. Southern states wanted to count slaves towards their representation in Congress. As you saw, there were tens of thousands of slaves in many of the states in the South. And so the compromise was reached that they would be allowed to count 3/5 of their slaves towards the population. So a slave would count as 3/5 of a free person. And an example here below is that 500 slaves in a state would equal 300 free people counted. So, today we would say, obviously they did not view slaves as equal to themselves when we are taking away the human side of things and saying they're not really a whole person. So 500 slaves would count as 300 free people. And the actual quote from the Constitution reads, "Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this Union, according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service or term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons." They didn't even call them slaves, they called them all other persons. Many of the Founding Fathers didn't want to dilute the grandness of this document by putting the word slave or slavery in there, and so they used the phrase all other persons. Also a part of this compromise was the issue of the slave trade in general. Many northern states wanted to completely get rid of the slave trade, which means they wanted to stop the importation of African slaves, like we talked about the Middle Passage and the Atlantic slave trade, completely. But of course, the South doesn't want that. That hurts their economy. They need that labor being brought in. And so another compromise was made that Congress could not end the importation of slaves until the date 1808. You're like, what, 1808? What does that matter? Well, that's actually roughly 20 years from when the Constitution was ratified, created. So 20 years would be left where they could be shipping in slaves. This map down here isn't talking about the slave trade, but it shows you a good representation for the 3/5 compromise to show you how much population gain towards representation, adding the slave count towards the state's population numbers gave them. So it actually, highly benefited the South when it came to representation in Congress. And again, if you'll notice down here, the actual words of the Constitution, the migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by Congress prior to the year 1808. But a tax or duty may be imposed on such importation, not exceeding $10 for each person. Again, they say such persons. They don't say slave. They don't want to put that word in there. So now the North has given up something to the South. The South will now give up something to the North, and this is over the issue of tariffs. So the federal government would be given the power in Congress to place tariffs on imports. They would have complete control on taxing imports into the nation from other countries. Congress would also be able to control trade between the states. That resolves the issue they had with the states taxing each other's products under the Articles of Confederation, and the fact that the federal government had literally zero power when it came to regulating trade in general. So this gave them a lot more power in that process, which they believed would help benefit the economy of the United States overall. So, review questions for the last part of the notes. What did the 3/5 Compromise call for? What compromise did the Founding Fathers make on the slave trade? And how was the issue over tariffs resolved?